Hi, I'm here today with Jonathan Grammer, who is the CEO of US Carbon Capture, and he has a legal practice which specializes in energy in its various manifestations, both hydrocarbons and electrons. And today we're going to discuss carbon capture and the energy transition. And I thank you for being here and taking the time, Jonathan.
My pleasure.
Um,
Thank you for having me.
yeah, absolutely. So, can you first tell me a little bit about US carbon capture, when it started and why it started?
Certainly, I would have to say the conceptual idea for it began about 10 years ago. And at that time, in what we were doing in the energy space, we were representing both oil companies and utility companies in various energy transactions, real estate matters, things of that nature. And both of those components had reached out to our team to help identify various pieces of the value chain for carbon storage. And at that time, we knew nothing about it specifically. Utility space was looking for our knowledge base concerning oil and gas reservoirs that might receive industrial CO2. And oil companies were looking to hire us to identify emitters that might be able to contribute CO2 for their EOR injection. And did an enormous amount of research and met a lot of people and did a lot of feed studies and geological studies. But those projects never developed. And then when carbon negative as a political agenda and as an energy agenda arose 2, 3 years ago in the context of climate change, we began revisiting a lot of that data, a lot of the research, and a lot of our contacts, and ultimately started recruiting a team to actually incorporate a company and do this professionally. I think the physical date of incorporation was in late 2020. And we're now in our third year, but it's been probably about a 15-year initiative over time coming to this point.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. So you started during the pandemic. That's kind of interesting.
Well, and to add, you know, a wrinkle to that answer, a lot of it was vaulted in Texas by Winter Storm Uri. And so, yeah, right about that time between the pandemic, and granted, a lot of people had a lot of time to visit during the pandemic too, so it was easy to get a hold of people and discuss. And then when Uri hit, we realized that there was going to be a real, uh, I think, in the midst of climate change, there was also going to be a fairly robust initiative to try to preserve safe fossil fuel energy in Texas. We just kind of fused those two initiatives together.
Mhm. Yeah, great. Um, so how do you describe like the state of carbon capture and sequestration now?
Well, as a play on words, it would depend on really what state you're in, and I mean physical states. And for example, states such as North Dakota and Wyoming and Montana, even Kansas, Louisiana. A lot of these states have fairly advanced regulatory regimes that are helping advance carbon storage and sequestration a lot faster than the state that I'm actually in and choose to work in, which is Texas, which is in a completely different state because we don't have the regulatory framework in place nor the statutory. And the two main things that are daily topics of conversation amongst our group that are holding back advancement of commercial deployment of carbon storage in Texas is the codification of the ownership of pore space, and then also long-term liability for migrating CO2. A lot of other states, and though I can't reference the statutes by exact number, they have vested liability for CO2, whatever that may be, in the state, and have provided funding for damages should CO2 cause damage that actually are fed out of the state treasury or by fees associated with carbon storage. And Texas doesn't have that.
Mm.
And right now, I was hopeful that those issues would be remedied in the 88th legislature. They were not.
Mm.
And so, were this conversation to take place regarding CCS in Montana or Wyoming, you might have a completely different, in fact, you do have a completely different conversation. It's moving quite rapidly. In Texas, it's a little bit further behind.
Mm. So some of these announcements then that you hear on the Gulf Coast, these CCS announcements, then that would that indicate that they're not quite ready for prime time, if that's the
It would.
case?
I think the announcements that you're seeing are they're certainly valid, and they're all it's great tangible work. But those are going to be the very early stages. They're announcing projects, and most of it is our land holdings, and a great deal of them are offshore. What you're not seeing announced, and you won't, is one, commitments by industrial emitters to dedicate their emissions to those projects, and two, you don't see a whole lot of um, permitting going on onshore. I think a lot of people have tied up an enormous amount of storage space, but whether or not they're legally justified at this point, and they have investor commitments behind them to start injecting into it, has yet to be seen for the reasons that I just suggested.
Mm. So are they injecting CO2 into, wherever they can in Montana and Wyoming at present that you know of?
Not wherever they can. That you have certain geological um, characteristics that have to be met. I don't follow the status of the
Those,
projects up there.
mhm,
I do know that there's primarily DAC is moving into those areas.
yeah,
I do know that they have a lot of the appropriate geology that's required for carbon storage. They've got good permeability, they got good shales, they got good seals up there, and it's at the appropriate depth to keep it at the requisite pressure. And it's in the middle of nowhere. There's not a lot of conflict with other competing uses of the subsurface freshwater table, uh,
mhm,
which is incredibly important.
yeah,
There's not a lot of competition, and there's not a lot of emitters. Texas is kind of its own thing in a
right,
lot of areas, and certainly is in carbon capture.
yeah. Huh, yeah, it would seem that there is a lot of, competition with, like, freshwater use and that sort of thing here in Texas. Because I mean, we have a huge population that keeps growing because of all the economic activity that's been, moving here. So that's going to be
Well, and
interesting
yeah, it is an interesting. Uh, it
dynamic.
yeah, it's an interesting dynamic, and if I were asked, that is the most common topic of conversation, though not really specific. You wouldn't think it would be, but it is the freshwater table in Texas. Uh,
Yep,
CO2 storage, carbon storage is obviously governed under the Safe Drinking Water Act, regulated by the EPA for that reason. Is that the real threat for underground carbon storage is if it migrates into fresh water. And if it does, you've got serious long-term problems. That is of relevance when you have an increased population and an increased demand on it. What at present, due to the drought, both the Edwards and the Ogallala, where I sit, are not in very robust state right now. One is recharged and one's been depleting for years. But carbon capture, in addition to its potential impact on fresh water, actually requires fresh water for cooling if you're running that
mm,
type of hardware. So, yeah, we could spend the balance of the hour talking about nothing but
yeah,
uh, the freshwater impact and that component in carbon capture.
yeah. So sort of framing up some of the fundamentals, so how is carbon currently captured? What state is it in? And sort of what are some of these early expectations? I know one thing you mentioned was direct air capture, and I believe there's a facility coming online in like 2025 or something, and that's Occidental Petroleum's, and
Mhm.
and those are heavily subsidized by the new IRA legislation.
Correct.
So what other ways are you seeing, initial carbon capture initiatives looking like?
Well, to answer your first part of your question, most of the current successful CO2 capture is taking place around, ethanol and natural produced CO2 and methane streams. And that separation process is extremely easy
Mm,
relative to the large scale industrial that we're talking about. And that's one of the great obstacles that I find with the general population. And even during the 88th, when we did some testimony on bills that had been proponed to advance carbon storage was the lack of knowledge in the general population and in the policymakers about when we say carbon capture, what does that mean? What does carbon look like in its unrefined form, and what does it look like in its captured and separated form? And in several processes, it can be very, very, very different. And in the ethanol process, the only thing that's required to put CO2 in a pipe in the ground is you have to dehydrate it and you have to compress it. It's virtually a pure stream of carbon dioxide. And so that's where we have seen in years past and at present a great deal of movement forward in being able to capture it because it's almost a ready to go substance. With respect to the large industrial emitter, steel, concrete, things that are burning biomatter to create heat and energy, certainly natural gas and coal-fired power plants, that separation process is not nearly as streamlined, and it's extremely difficult. In fact, it very rarely has it even been proven. That was what Petronova down in Fort Bend County was constructed to do, and was ultimately closed down for different economic reasons and is now being revitalized. But those are facilities that require an enormous amount of energy, a lot of water, a lot of infrastructure built out, very expensive to run. And that's why you don't see real good test cases of that type of a separation, because pulling that CO2, which is anywhere between 10 and 15% of the emissions out, is very difficult. And so the state of that will probably, those will be the refineries along the Gulf Coast. That's going to be, I hope, very, very successful initiative. That's going to be a very, very long-term one too, just because of all the research and development and the build out that's going to be required. The ethanol facilities in the Midwest, though, are a different story. And that's where a great deal of the carbon capture efforts motivated to secure those tax credits will be going, because it's going to require the least amount of CapEx expenditure in the beginning to get it. And so depending on what stream of CO2 you're talking about, you're going to look at completely two different tracks that are evolving, one moving very, very slow and the other one moving very, very rapidly.
So the ethanol track is moving faster because of all of its characteristics and economics, if you will.
Yeah. And to your point about direct air capture, while I think, I have to assume I don't know, but most people that I come in contact with seem to agree that it probably has the lowest efficiency rate of the technology that's out there. And I have not seen firsthand that data, but that's the general consensus. However, it seems to be getting a great deal of traction just because it's so tangible. You know, a lot of this still remains to be theoretical if this can be done. But DAC is literally, it's a big fan, and you can see test cases of it. You can go look at examples of it. You can stack it. You can build it. From an investor standpoint, it's a lot easier to move forward advancing something that you can actually put your hands around, rather than some theoretical capture process that, if when asked, where is this currently functioning using MEA solution on an industrial scale to separate CO2 successfully, it's very difficult to identify a successful candidate.
I think what's ironic is, from what you hear in the media and some of these different groups forming these, discussing CCS hubs and all that, you would think that we're further along, but in fact, what you're saying is we are really at the early stages. We are at the onset. We're just like, we haven't even stepped foot on the moon,
Well, I think that may be, I think that's perfectly fair. And we're talking about, now we're shifting gears and talking about almost a political marketing media issue, which is, I would say, the same thing perhaps about the energy transition as a whole, that it seems to be being proposed as a very turnkey step in our path forward, as if we're just deviating on an off ramp to get on another highway that's already paved.
Right.
And And that's, when things are politically motivated and things have an enormous amount of lobby and financial interest at stake, advancing a marketing scheme is very, very important. So I don't fault it for that. But the reality of it is that these are going to be really slow and really big course corrections
Yeah.
that are going to take a very, very long time. And a lot of intelligent people, which I hope to include myself, are putting an enormous amount of effort. But the ticks on the metronome are going to be very, very slight.
Hmm.
If you were to follow the media, you would think nothing but. You would believe
Yeah.
that you could drive down to the Gulf Coast today and
Yeah.
see pipes being run out of the ocean for storage.
Yeah.
I don't believe that that's anything you're going to see in the short term.
Yeah. So is there, you kind of mentioned, the different geographies and regulatory regimes. Is there, in your mind, a better geography and region for this in terms of, physical properties and that sort of thing? What do you
But
think?
what we're looking for in a sequestration model is preferably a depth. Let me tell you what the ingredients are we try to find, and then the ingredients we try to get away from. Um, a depth of about 6,000, 7,000 feet. Looking for a highly permeable rock layer that will ideally would have stored hydrocarbons, but we don't want any hydrocarbons in that reservoir that we find. That has an overlying seal, preferably shale, several hundred feet in thickness and an anticline formation to make a trap. It's basically the reverse of looking for oil and gas. You're looking for something in the subsurface that will hold substances for a very long time, but there are no substances in it. And we would like inside of that porous rock there to be a great deal of salt water
Mm,
reservoirs, which um, is highly prevalent in a great deal of the subsurface of Texas, yet very little is known about it because there's
mm,
really been no economic interest in studying saltwater reservoirs of Texas. There's a great deal of information out there, but not very much testing has ever been done.
mm,
Uh, we we need to find because of that depth, you're trying to get away from the freshwater table and make sure that there's enough of rock layer between it. If you did have upward migration of carbon dioxide, which is known for being very buoyant, that it's not going to reach your freshwater table over time. A lot of these projects are going to be 20 to 30 years in time. CO2 can do a lot underground. We would hope that it would migrate laterally, but there's
mm,
potential for it to come up. And if that's the
mhm,
case, you need to have a scenario in place.
mm,
So that's what we're looking for. Deep saline reservoirs, highly porous rock, a shale seal on top of it, and we'd like minimal oil and gas production around it, so that we don't have other stakeholders in the subsurface that have to have a seat at the table.
mhm.
Uh, that is one of the conversations that's slowly moving together is carbon storage and the oil and gas industry in Texas. That's a discussion for almost an entire other interview.
Yeah.
But the fewer stakeholders and the fewer variables you can have in your storage reservoir area, the better. And that includes agriculture too.
Mhm.
All these things being said, it's not difficult to ascertain that what we're really looking for is low populated areas, low value in surface use. You don't want any other competing revenue streams that might be concerned about CO2 injection. And that's led us primarily to deep south and deep west Texas. Some
Mhm.
of it moving into western Oklahoma, maybe even southwestern Kansas. Your highly rural areas, large tract positions, because pore space, for the most part, though not codified, attaches to the surface acreage. So we're looking for a group of subsurface pores where this carbon dioxide can spread out over years, not
Mhm.
going beyond property boundaries. So ideally, we're looking for about 20,000 acres under common ownership, both surface and minerals, and away from highly populated areas. So
Mhm.
that's primarily all those variables seem to align in deep South Texas and deep West Texas.
Mm, okay. And so that's that's really an area ideally that you would like to be in ultimately if you had your choice of development opportunities
Or for
or
storage, yes.
for storage, yeah.
That
But
raises another problem, is that it's a long, long way away from the emitters.
yes, right.
And
Yes,
so those make very good storage complex candidates. It then leaves you with an enormous problem of that most of the emissions you're trying to get rid of are several hundred miles away.
right. The
Uh,
transmission
that's
issue,
right.
the logistics of it. Yeah.
You just secured an appropriate storage complex, just talking theoretically, for $1 million or $2 million. You tied up everything that you will need to store CO2 successfully for the next 3 decades. Unfortunately, you just bought yourself a $450 million pipeline to get it out there, and probably years of eminent domain and right of way to get it constructed. Uh, that's why, again, some people think DAC may be the candidate. If you find your storage complex in a remote region, you could theoretically put your DAC unit right on top of it and suck your
Mhm.
emissions right out of the air and not have to get them at point source emitters. And
Right.
that would alleviate the need to build a pipeline.
Yeah. Hmm. That's interesting. And we know that the tax credits for that are quite steep, which is sort of basically
Yeah,
that.
they're huge. They're enormous, and I'm remiss that I have not visited the exact numbers in some time. Granted, we're
It's
not pursuing DAC, but it's fairly high, especially when you stack the CARB, the California Air Resources Board. I think the DAC IRA 45Q is 120, 125. It's significant.
it is. It's a big commitment. So we kind of mentioned stakeholder groups, that might advance this first being this ethanol um, group initially, and then obviously like the Exxon Mobil's, they're trying to do this, and I guess on the Gulf Coast, and then ideally storing it, under the
Yeah.
ocean floor. That's kind of their track. Are there any other first movers that we haven't discussed, or did we kind of get the big ones?
I think yeah, we've named a lot of the
We've
big
hit.
ones.
Okay.
If I was to make a list of participants that could bring necessary momentum to help push it, every 6 months that goes by, it seems we gather. It seems like we lose a player, we lose some momentum, maybe politically or in the media. One of them happened a couple of days ago when China pulled out of Paris Climate Accords, or EPA versus West Virginia case that came down. Every now and then you get a stroke that makes people think, well, perhaps this decarbonization movement won't stick. And for every one that we lose, we gather another log on the fire, so to speak.
Yeah.
Exxon purchasing Denbury. That's one that's
Yes.
taken the last couple of weeks. It gave a lot of momentum to the issue.
Yeah.
But if I were to make a list of just a couple of participants that we could really benefit stepping up with more momentum. One is more interest from the actual emitters themselves. That's been kind of a sidelines discussion for the most part. You see a lot of work in the storage complex. You see a lot of work in, drafting and proposing new bills. There's just a lot of discussion in the CCS area, but the emitters seem to be sort of with their arms folded.
Hmm.
We're going to wait and see, or very easily that they just haven't made their internal decisions about how they're going to decarbonize. I think
Hmm.
that's probably the more accurate depiction. Is a lot of these net zero policies are out there and they're public and they've been released to shareholders in quarterly statements. But internally, it doesn't appear that a great deal of the people putting industrial CO2 up into the air have made a firm decision about whether carbon capture and storage is really going to be a part of their solution, or if it's going to be fuel switching or some other path. So that would be really beneficial, I think, to the CCS if there was more of an emitter conversation that involved.
Hmm.
And the
Yeah.
second one is, as much as I'm chagrined to say it, is more government um, involvement, certainly in the state of Texas. We don't have nearly the the I don't know if it's healthy or not. I don't necessarily always like to see an intertwining between private business and government, but that is the state we live in, and those are the times. Is we need more statutory protection for CO2 and for CO2 activities in Texas, if nothing else, to alleviate the uncertainty in the market that will invite new investment. I think a great deal of private money is sitting on the sidelines because it is still an undescribed and unregulated industry that's not been tested. It's not really regulated very well. It doesn't have really any formalized regulations. Our application for primacy, which essentially would give the Texas Railroad Commission the authority to permit Class 6 wells in the state of Texas, has not been approved. The rules that have been drafted are still being discussed. We're going to need a little bit more bite of the apple from
Mm-hmm.
state government in Texas uh, to really advance this. And
Mm-hmm.
so those two stakeholders alone, more emitter contribution and certainly more um, guidance from state government, would certainly help in the state of Texas advance
So,
CCS.
so in some ways, this IRA legislation, which was passed to incentivize more carbon capture, um, you know, it sounds like it can't move forward in certain spaces because of the lack of state regulatory
That's
action
that's a great way to put it. That's
and
great.
then industry buy-in. So in fact, there's serious dysfunction in a way.
Yeah.
It's not a working market. It's not a market yet, right? It's
Well,
the formation of a market.
you could ask several other people, give you a completely different answer than what I'm getting ready to say. But I'm one of those people out there that really, because I believe so strongly in the potential possibilities of carbon capture and storage. But I also believe that if it doesn't have a sound economic model to it that makes sense, that's simple, it's not going to last,
Mhm.
regardless of how great the ideas sound. The IRA has really, in my opinion, kind of prohibited that discussion from happening. Is that you have this massive government subsidy, and it's large. And
Yeah.
for those that don't understand how it works, when you're being rewarded for successful capture at $85 a ton, if your 1,000 or 700 megawatt power plant puts out 1 million tons a year, you're getting $85 million in direct pay
Hmm.
every year. That's an incredible amount of money that's out there to go get it. However, what it has gotten in the way of is letting the market decide for itself what it wants to pay for carbon free stuff.
Hmm.
And I was hopeful, and don't get me wrong, I'm not being critical of the IRA tax credit, but it is making the conversation more difficult. If this were evolving much in the way saltwater disposal did, where you have a fee that we're assessing against someone that produces it, they're paying a service provider to take it away, and that service provider is paying someone to store it. And what's left in the middle is your profit. And the industry has decided this is what we want to pay to get rid of this substance. And it works. And people have made a great deal of money, and it seems to help the oil industry, and it's helped landowners that have saltwater disposal wells. People have made a great deal of money, and we've learned and gotten better at doing it. There's very little incentive from the federal government. That's not evolving in carbon storage because they're really the only economic variable we're going after is a potential tax credit if you're successful. I don't know if that's going to be a long-term business model that helps sustain carbon capture. I can tell you it makes people a little weary because the IRA tax credit barely passed. I think there's some reluctance that perhaps I don't think it's going to, but there's a potential that it could be legislatively taken away at some point too.
Well, on this on the incentive, you said it's like $85 to capture carbon. Does that include storing it? It has to have a place to go, right? I mean,
Well, yeah, you have to have the value chain complete to store it, but that's 100% capture rate. You've taken it out of your emission stream. You've proven it at your point source emitter meter. Um, and yeah, you can't just capture it and release it again. But yeah, that assumes that you have an end user for it, or ideally in the form of a storage complex. Now there are discussions about transferring that into some sort of carbon product at some point. But yeah, that makes the assumption that you've got an end user for it. And one of those things can be, we haven't talked about it, it can be the oil and gas industry. There's a lower
Right.
tax credit of $60 a metric ton if you utilize that CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, which is
Hmm.
a
Yeah.
chemical process that uses CO2 that can stimulate legacy oil fields.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know that that's something that's of interest to the industry. And then, as we've discussed, you still have to get the carbon that's captured to the oil field. You still have that transmission cost in between, right?
Mhm.
So that's the practicality of it. So is there anything missing from this sort of top level conversation that we've had? And then we can switch a little bit to your project. Um,
No, I think we've done a good job. Good
okay.
job capturing everything at the high level.
I mean, is there anything at a low level that you feel that we should that you wanted to mention though?
Well, when I think low level, I think ground
Or
game. And
level?
from the ground, there's, as we started off, there's what you read about in the media, and then there's what I've observed actually out there doing it, sitting in executive boardrooms and really approaching landowners about carbon storage. I've gotten some fascinating feedback that I don't think you would be able to deduce was important because it's not getting any circulation. Is, you know, going back to our conversation about the concern over the freshwater tables in Texas, 85% of the state is categorized as, and I talked earlier about the things that make Texas perhaps not the best candidate for carbon storage. I'm going to shift gears and talk about the things that do, and not from low level, but from being on the ground with people that
Yeah.
we've talked to, is that a vast majority of the state right now is going through a transition of trying to establish what the revenue stream is going to be for the next generation. And I said 85% a minute ago. 85% of Texas is classified as working. That's either agriculture, ranching, or forest.
Hmm.
And for the former two of those, we're probably going through some of the most difficult times. One is the drought. Several other conditions are going. Supply chain and COVID still linger. It's just not a very easy time, and I don't know that it ever has been, to be a cattle rancher, to be in agriculture. And that combined with the fact that in the next 10 years, the baby boomer generation is going to be expiring and passing down trillions of dollars of real estate value, most of which is looking for a new revenue stream, drought
Hmm.
resistant crops. Renewables has sort of filled in that component in some areas, but in still a lot of the reaches of Texas, we still have general transmission constraints. All this being said is we're finding a really receptive audience to something new that can bring in a perpetual revenue stream to agricultural property. The
Hmm.
Permian Basin has gotten an enormous amount of attention, but it doesn't really cover as large of a footprint as people think. There's a vast amount of Texas right now. It's having a hard time making enough money to keep the land in its family.
Yeah.
And what I hope that carbon storage can be one of those possibilities. I don't know with what rapidity it's going to be. A lot of that's going to be dependent upon the issues we talked about earlier, the stakeholders helping advance the industry. But that's an interesting conversation that I wish was getting more traction out there. Is we are potentially solving a problem for rural Texas, and we've gotten that on the hoods of pickup trucks and the front porches of people we've talked to that are interested in finding some new way to bring revenue into their legacy agricultural properties.
Right. Right. Yeah. And you and I have discussed that because I actually have a project in the
That's right.
Panhandle that
We've had
I'm trying to do that very thing. Bring
well, and
revenue streams.
that's
Yeah.
an authentic piece of the discussion that in all the decarbonization and all of the high level talks that we've had, all of this comes down to land rights. And
Yeah.
to your point, you just asked me the question that assumes that you have a place to put it, and that's right. We can talk about all these large objectives and actually be successful with all the technical and all the economics and all the politics. But at the end of the day, this is going to come down to the landowner is the
Right.
one that holds the gate open or not.
Right.
And that's a piece of the conversation that is missing that I think is
Yeah.
probably the most interesting, certainly the most human, and
Yeah.
the most relevant going forward.
Sure. Yeah,
So,
absolutely. It's the impact, it's where the impact can be. I mean, it can be win-win. You just have to figure out how to do it. And like you said, all the technical aspects of storing it, and moving it and the economics. Do you think, I mean, I don't know if this is something you followed much, just the development of carbon markets, when carbon is priced. I know that it's very fragmented again, all over the
mhm.
world. Do you feel like if we had a working carbon market that would help? Because it would help define some of the economics of all this.
I, I, bel I believe that it does just because I've been around other people that do as well. I know that's an authentic justification for my answer.
Yeah,
I hear a lot of on panels and interviews, people I've met in the industry that say that, and I mention that because I don't know the success of the carbon markets in Europe and other places, just because that's not the space that I work in. But I have heard that commentary quite a bit that a more well-defined carbon market might do more long term than just a subsidy.
yeah,
Uh, and I certainly, there was a time when you could see nothing but jockeying over what the exact price of carbon was. Is it what, and which I think is a relevant conversation is, what is it worth? Is it worth $85 a ton? Is it worth 50? What is the impact to a company releasing it? What is the impact of the company if they capture it from a market cap valuation standpoint? There's all kinds of ways to go about it. But I think pricing, to pull from economic theory, is one of the most valuable things that we have. You
yeah,
put a price on something, we think of it mostly as just a number that you pay for something, but it really establishes what society's value of this particular thing
yeah,
is, and it
absolutely.
changes with market conditions. And if
Yeah,
we had a price that said we are much akin to salt water, we know exactly what we can pay to get rid of salt water and still drill a well that produces it if the barrel of oil is priced at a certain price. It just makes a lot of sense. Is carbon is $75 a metric ton, and then you can let the market evolve around it. Prices can come up for consumer products, be it steel or concrete or energy. And so there's a lot of support for that. And I think rightfully so, that if you just priced carbon itself rather than subsidizing its capture, you
yeah,
might be able to make an economic model evolve quicker
yeah.
that's going to keep this together longer.
Right. Yeah, a market would develop around it. The market would decide, just like with natural gas, just like with oil, just like with corn.
Yeah.
I mean, they work. you know. Sort of transitioning a little bit. Um, we talked about the fact that your CCS interests evolved partly from your law practice and some of the oil and gas and solar developments that you're doing. Can you share any about any projects that you're involved in that are kind of you're seeing things changing?
I think in
Evolve.
a general, a good question is, and as it relates to carbon capture and storage, is that because so many of the emitters, the relevant emitters, are power plants. And a great deal of the CO2 emissions that are coming up, well, all of them really, are from the burning of biomatter to create energy. It's very, it's usually very early on in a conversation with an emitter that we've had about approaching them about implementing carbon capture that we start talking about fuel switching. And we shift gears completely into a completely other component of the energy transition, which is renewables and batteries. What I mean by that is we're talking about preservation of burning biomatter that puts off CO2 when you heat it up, when you combust it. You can also eliminate CO2 by just getting rid of that fuel source altogether. And that's another market that's coming up in competition at the same time and has an enormous amount of political advocacy to do so. And so solar has become a very real player in the carbon capture talk, is that to the extent that if someone is burning natural gas and putting off a certain volume of carbon dioxide every year, in addition to entertaining carbon capture, they can also and are also entertaining shifting to all solar and waiting on battery storage technology to come up. Now, the latter of that is not really readily deployable on a large scale right now. I don't know. I think the limits we're somewhere around 10 hours of storage capacity. I think there's projections that we're within 3, 4, 5 years of having good 100-hour battery storage. And if that becomes the case on your large 1,000 megawatt, 2,000 megawatt solar arrays, then you can be very competitive with fossil fuels. This is theoretical. It's just as theoretical as some of the carbon capture that's being proposed. But there's a real relevance, and we're seeing that a lot in conversations with government, with management boards of emitters. They're quite readily agreeable to share with us that they are entertaining fuel source as much as they may be looking at carbon capture and storage. And that's why you're seeing, at least I have, quite a bit of solar development and land rights being secured for solar development and battery storage in the southwestern United States right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you're kind of working on a project. Are you early in the project, or I mean, when are
Very,
when
yeah,
very
very
early? Yeah.
right.
And do you envision more of these for yourself in your practice? I mean, do you see a
Gosh, I would certainly hope so, and that's one of the things that I guess has defined what we do. Historically, I would say if I had to fill up a graph, we've always been heavier on oil and gas um, than anything else. It's certainly where my affection lies. That's where a great deal of my trade association involvement is, and all my training and education, and all the people that work for me and that I work around, they're all oil and gas background. But the skill set that we've acquired from the transactional standpoint, the legal education and the understanding of land rights has much larger applications than that. And so we have been
right?
involved in quite a few solar projects and transmission and pipeline and financing agreements and A&D between companies buying each other. And so we've really been able and successful and fortunate, excuse me, to walk several paths in energy development, really consider it to be one thing rather
Yeah,
than all these
right.
subsets. So this all being said, I'm always welcome to receive any energy development project in the door that requires somebody to know the land and the law, which is
Yeah,
why we've been able to diversify. So to answer your question,
right.
whatever solar project comes in the door, if we have the bandwidth, we'll take it. That's true of carbon capture and oil and gas. We're really good, and we like developing the natural resources of Texas, and we just don't limit it to one component of the energy industry. So yes, I'm really hopeful. These are good projects, and there's a need out there for people intelligently to do it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would welcome a large scale solar
Mm.
project, um, and I see more of those coming.
Yeah. And yeah, it sounds like over time you had to adopt a multidisciplinary approach, and that this energy transition, quote unquote, it just means you have to kind of know more. You have to be able to complement all these various energy assets, and
Right.
evolve
Well,
your
and
skill sets.
let's be clear about what the energy transition means. We kind of have bad habits in society of coming up with acronyms and hashtags and buzzwords, and then they take on a life of their own and they get used for various different narratives. But the energy transition I don't know what the general population thinks about that phrase, but it's not shifting from fossil fuels to renewables.
Right.
It's shifting from it's shifting to a mentality in which all of these energy sources are working together in their relative percentages of the larger piece. And you mentioned our solar work. Really, the relevance of what we've done in the solar space is that a lot of the work is right on top of existing oil production.
Yeah.
And we're finding ways for these projects to develop in the same, make the same footprint for the participants and the leadership to get along, to
Right.
utilize each other's benefits so that what they're doing works stronger for a longer period of time. And that's what this energy transition is going to be about. It's not one horse winning over the other. It's how do all
Right.
five horses place in
Right.
the race.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And there's a lot of, politicization about it, on both
Uh,
sides, and which isn't helpful. We've sort of discussed that. But yeah, so you're playing in the middle and doing, well, practical things, pragmatic things to, advance the energy mix as we need to, a cleaner energy mix overall, however we get there is,
sure.
kind of what it sounds like. Um, is there anything that you wanted to add that you um, found important or missing in the conversation?
No, I think your questions have been very insightful and have helped draw out, you know, the real authentic pieces that I wanted to get up and in front of people. So
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I look forward to hearing your progress in the future. I'm sure it's going to be changing, and evolving. So we'll have to catch up again in the future.
absolutely. Thanks for your time, Jennifer.
Sure.